We want to welcome anyone that might just be tuning in with us online. We'll have a quick word of prayer for those just tuning in. Father, we ask that you'll bless this time as we study your word. Please open our understanding, transform us into your image. Please use us for your glory and for your kingdom. Bless this time with your presence and just open our eyes to your truth. Empower us to be obedient. We thank you so much for the gift of Yeshua. In his name we pray, hallelujah. Today's message is The New Testament Does Not Speak of Itself, Part 2. And we're going to focus on the difference between Old Testament law and New Testament law. There is one verse that says to fulfill the law of Christ. And the word law is found many times in the New Testament. But is there any biblical reason to conclude that the Messiah had his own new law different from his father's? Is there a difference between Yahweh's law and Yeshua's law? Did he do away with Yahweh's law and establish Yeshua's law? There are a few places in the New Testament that talk about the new covenant. So technically, when we say the title is The New Testament Doesn't Speak of Itself, technically that's not true because it does talk about a new covenant. So we're going to look at those exceptions and see exactly what it's talking about. So let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1. Do we begin again to commend ourselves, or need we, as some other epistles of commendation to you, or letters of commendation from you? You are our epistles, written in our hearts, known and read of all men. So this is an epistle written in hearts, which can be seen by other men. That's kind of a little hint of an indicator as to what he's talking about. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Messiah, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living Elohim, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart. Again, something written on the heart. We're going to find out why he's using these words. And such trust have we through Messiah to Elohim, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of Elohim, who hath made us able ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. Some translations do say New Testament here. The Greek word is 1242, and in every place in the New Testament where the word covenant is used, 1242, the Greek word is there. So he's referring to a new covenant here. Now, let's look at, and by the way, I will do a little side note here. There are some people that believe that the new covenant has not come yet. I would strongly disagree with that. There are some people who believe that there's actually only one covenant, and this new covenant that is being spoken of is actually the old covenant that is being renewed. I would have to strongly disagree with that. And the reason I feel like they want to do that is because they believe that Yahweh's Torah is the old covenant, and it's obvious in Scripture that the Torah, his law, has not been done away with. So by extension, they don't want to do away with the old covenant because they think that's trying to do away with the law. But we read last week what the covenant was the agreement between Yahweh and Israel. If you obey me, you'll be my people. They said, everything you ask us to do, we're going to do. They entered into covenant. And then he revealed to them what his law was. And we also mentioned that he had law long before Mount Sinai, before Israel existed, before a Jew existed, he had law. So let's look at Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 21. Tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, plural, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Verse 27, for it is written, rejoice thou barren that bearest not, break forth and cry thou that travailest not, for the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now, showing that these two covenants, one after the flesh, one after the Spirit. And under the old covenant and the Torah could not change the flesh. The new covenant is involving the Spirit, which changes the heart of man. That's the comparison of the two covenants. And pointing out that it's very clear, it's distinctly referring to two of them. So it can't be one that's being renewed. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 6. But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, better than the first one, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for a second. Again, very clear distinction between two covenants. One had a fault. And if it didn't have a fault, then there would not have been a need for a second. And he tells us what this second one is. For finding fault with them, meaning the people, he saith, behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. So this second new covenant is not like the covenant that he made when he brought them out of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith Yahweh. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith Yahweh. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them an Elohim, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall, and this verse right here is why some people say we're not there yet, we haven't entered into this new covenant. And I'll explain that. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. So they say, well, everybody's still being taught, and everybody don't know Yahweh, so we can't be in the new covenant. Well, guess what? If you're in the new covenant, you don't have, nobody has to tell you how to know him. If you're in the new covenant, you know him. And in 1 John, it says, you have no need that anyone teach you because the Holy Spirit that's inside of you will teach you all things. So that's why it says you won't have to teach your neighbor, because the Holy Spirit is inside of you and he has taught you to know Yahweh, which is obedience. He that says, I know him and keeps not his commandments is a liar. So that's what it means to know Yahweh. And a very good description. Oh, let's look at Jeremiah 31 first. By the way, Hebrews 8 and Hebrews chapter 10 is quoting Jeremiah 31. And it's worded just a little bit different. Jeremiah 31, verse 31. Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith Yahweh. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith Yahweh. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. Now, he says right here that I will put my law in their inward parts. The Hebrew word there in your Strong's Concordance is 8451. It's Torah. It means his instructions. So when we read through our Bible and we see this word law all throughout the Bibles, his instructions, his instructions, his instructions. Is there anything in the Bible that would lead us to believe that on this side of the book, instructions means one thing, but on this side of the book, instructions mean something entirely different? And I would submit that if you put any man on an island with this book right here with no teacher, there is no way in heck he can come to the end of this book and not realize that the Almighty doesn't want him to obey. Not possible. You cannot come to that conclusion. The only way you can come to the conclusion that he doesn't want you to obey is by a bad teacher. So we're going to visit that word Torah in numerous places. But before we go there, let's look at Ezekiel 36 and verse 24. And by the way, we just read writing it on the hearts and in their minds, and that's probably where Paul was getting that illustration in Corinthians, the epistle written on the hearts, seen of all men. Ezekiel 36 and verse 24. For I will take you from amongst the heathen and gather you out of all countries and will bring you into your own land. This is another reason why some people say we're not in the new covenant yet, because we haven't made it into the land. Well, that's going to be the final reality of the conclusion when the Messiah returns to bring his people back to the land. But the bringing out from the heathen and gathering out from the countries, that's already started. And that's why Peter and Paul received their commission. Peter had a vision in Acts chapter 10. Paul had an encounter on the road to Damascus, and both were told to take their message to the heathen, to the nations. And that was to fulfill the prophecy of Israel coming back into covenant. He had to invite everybody to fulfill these scriptures. Verse 25, then will I sprinkle clean water upon you. That word then is actually not in the Hebrew. It actually just says, I'm going to sprinkle clean water upon you. And you shall be clean from all your filthiness, and from all your idols will I cleanse you. So if the word then actually was there, it almost looks like it's saying, I'm going to bring you into your own land, and then I'm going to do it. But that's not what it says. It says, I'm going to take you out from the heathen. I'm going to bring you into your own land. I'm going to sprinkle you with clean water, and you shall be clean from all your filthiness, and from all your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. If you have not experienced this, a new heart and a new spirit, you're missing something. And that's part of the new covenant, to have a new heart, to have a new spirit that gives you a desire to obey, brings your flesh into submission, and you want to obey the Father out of a heart of love. Verse 27. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments and do them. So this new spirit will cause you to walk in obedience. So if this has happened to you, if you do have a new heart, if you do have a new spirit that causes you to obey, how can you say that you're not in the new covenant? And how can you say that you are a Gentile in the new covenant but not have his Torah in your heart? And there's millions of people in the world today that claim that they're new covenant Christians, but they think that the law was done away with, and we're under this new law of Christ, saved by grace. Just keep two of them, you keep all of them. So let's look at a few places where this word, the law that's supposed to be put in our hearts, let's look at a few places where that word is found. Genesis chapter 26. And verse 4. Genesis 26 and verse 4, he's talking to Isaac here, Abraham's son. And he says, and I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. That means all the Gentiles of the earth are going to be blessed through your seed. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. That word laws right there is the same exact word of what he's going to put in our hearts under the new covenant. And I want to put a side note on obey my voice. We're going to revisit that. We're going to find out what obeying his voice is. But notice here, obeying his voice is tied to keeping his charge, his commandments, his statutes, and his laws. Long before a Jew existed, long before Israel existed, long before Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, and all that, Abraham was obeying his voice, his commandments, his statutes, and his laws. Let's look at Exodus chapter 12 and verse 47. Exodus 12 and verse 47. This is referring to the Passover. It says, all the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as one that is born in the land. That's Old Testament grafting in there, people. For no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law, that's the word right there that's supposed to be put in our hearts. One law shall be to him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourns among you. And if the stranger obeys the Torah, he becomes native born in the land. Let's look at chapter 13 of Exodus, starting in verse 6. 7 days thou shalt eat unleavened bread, and in the seventh day shall be a feast to Yahweh. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and there shall no leavened bread be seen with thee, neither shall there be leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. And thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, this is done because of that which Yahweh did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. And it shall be for a sign unto thee upon thine hand, and for a memorial between thine eyes, that Yahweh's law, his Torah, may be in thy mouth. For with a strong hand hath Yahweh brought thee out of Egypt. And again, this is before the law was given or revealed at Mount Sinai. Let's look at chapter 16 of Exodus and verse 4. Yahweh is testing his people with the manna. Then said Yahweh unto Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my Torah, my law, or not. So this, and by the way, this is the Sabbath. What we call it? The Sabbath prep day, where you go out and get double on Friday. Yeah, the pre-Sabbath. Yeah, yeah. The guy said we needed a pre-Sabbath, and what they were thinking is maybe we need a little time off before the Sabbath. And I said, well, actually, they work double on that day to prepare for the Sabbath. Yeah. So let's look at verse 27 of chapter 16. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. And Yahweh said unto Moses, how long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? Again, proving that Yahweh had commandments and laws long before they were given at Mount Sinai. He was just, and something that ties in really well with this, in Nehemiah, it actually says that he revealed to them the Sabbath. He revealed it. So showing that it was not some new institution. Let's look at Exodus chapter 18 and verse 14. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, what is this thing that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning unto even? And Moses said unto his father-in-law, because the people come unto me to inquire of Elohim. When they have a matter, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of Elohim and his laws. So Moses is teaching statutes and laws before Mount Sinai. And let's look at chapter 24, verse 12 of Exodus. Chapter 24, verse 12. And Yahweh said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount, and be there, and I will give thee tables of stone, and a law, and commandments, which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 46. Now, chapter 11 is the dietary chapter, showing the difference between clean and unclean. And he says in verse 46, this is the law, this is the Torah of the beasts, or the animals, and of the fowl, and of every living creature that moveth in the waters, and every creature that creepeth upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, and between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. So this is part of his Torah. Let's look at chapter 26 of Leviticus and verse 46. When I read this verse for the first time, or when it really grabbed my attention, the reason I found it is because I was discussing Matthew chapter 5, where it says, if anyone breaks the least of the commandments and teaches other people to do the same, he'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And this person says, well, that's just talking about the 10 Commandments. It's not talking about the rest of the law. That was done away with. And I'm like, well, he's got more than 10 Commandments. And it's like, no, there's only 10. So I did a little word study, and I stumbled across this verse. Actually, I think that might be a different verse. Hold on one second. 26. Yeah, 26:46 says, these are the statutes and judgments and laws which Yahweh made between him and the children of Israel in Mount Sinai by the hand of Moses. Now look at the last verse of the whole book, which is 27:34. So he sums up the whole book of Leviticus with, these are the commandments which Yahweh commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. proving that anything Yahweh tells you to do or tells you not to do, that is a commandment and it's part of his Torah. Let's look at Numbers chapter 15 and verse 15. One ordinance shall be both for you of the congregation and also for the stranger that sojourns with you, an ordinance forever. Notice, it said he's talking to Israel here, and he's saying you're going to have one ordinance for you and for the stranger, and it's always going to be like this. This is forever. Throughout your generations, as you are, so shall the stranger be before Yahweh. Kind of sounds like if somebody's grafted in, they're supposed to be doing what you're doing. Verse 16, one law, one Torah, and one manner shall be for you and for the stranger that sojourns with you. Let's look at verse 29 of the same chapter. You shall have one law for him that sins through ignorance, both for him that is born amongst the children of Israel and for the stranger that sojourns among you. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now therefore hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you, for to do them, that you may live, and go in and possess the land which Yahweh, Elohim of your fathers, giveth you. Now this next verse right here should be a red flag in our minds when we hear a false doctrine. You shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish anything from it. Why? So that you can keep the commandments of Yahweh or Elohim which I command you. If you tamper with his word, you can't keep the commandments. If you add to it or take away from it, you can't keep his commandments. So, when his people hear a doctrine from the nations that want to be grafted in, and they're trying to say, he did away with them commandments, he did them so we don't have to, they're obsolete, this verse right here should be a big red flag. Let's look at verse 5, same chapter. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as Yahweh my Elohim commanded me that you should do so in the land whither you go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there so great, who hath Elohim so nigh unto them, as Yahweh our Elohim is in all things that we call upon him? And what nation is there so great that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? Did you hear that? His Torah, his law, his commandments are supposed to be a shining light and a beacon to the nations of wisdom and understanding. That sounds like something he's going to do away with. Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, and lest they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life, but teach them to thy sons and thy sons' sons, until my son comes along and tells you they're done away with. That don't make no sense. You're supposed to teach it to your children and your children's children forever, but my child's going to come and tell you I did away with them? I did them so you don't have to? Probably not. Let's look at chapter 20. verse 25 of the same chapter. When thou shalt beget children and children's children, and you shall have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourselves, and make a graven image or the likeness of anything, and shall do evil in the sight of Yahweh thy Elohim to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that you shall soon utterly perish from off the land whereunto you go over Jordan to possess it. You shall not prolong your days upon it, but shall utterly be destroyed because of disobedience. And there's a reason he said, I call heaven and earth to witness against you. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. Verse 27, and Yahweh shall scatter you amongst the nations, which is where Peter and Paul went to call them out. And you shall be left few in number amongst the heathen, where Yahweh shall lead you. And there you shall serve mighty ones, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. But if from thence, from amongst the heathen, thou shalt seek Yahweh thy Elohim, thou shalt find him, if thou seek him with all thy heart and with all thy soul, when thou art in tribulation, and all these things are come upon thee, when? Even in the latter days, in the last days, when you're amongst the heathen, the Gentiles, if you search for him, you're going to find him. If thou turn to Yahweh thy Elohim and shalt be obedient to his voice. That's why I put a side note on it. So in the last days, Israel is supposed to wake up from amongst the Gentiles and hear his voice and start being obedient. So is this a new voice? Is it a different voice? I would submit that in the last days, listening to the voice of Yahweh is the same voice that Abraham listened to, which is why the hearts of the children are going to turn back to the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the hearts of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are going to return to the children, which is what the prophecy of John the Baptist and the last day spirit and power of Elijah was. And we're a fulfillment of that. When we wake up and stop living like heathens and start obeying the voice of Yahweh, we're a fulfillment of the hearts of the children turning back to the fathers. It doesn't mean that the fathers and the children are going to start getting along in the last days. It means that we're going to turn back to the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's look at verse 40, same chapter. Thou shalt keep therefore his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee this day, that it may go well with thee and with thy children after thee, and that thou mayest prolong thy days upon the earth, which Yahweh thy Elohim giveth thee forever. And I put this in my notes, but I'm not going to go there for the sake of time. But the whole Deuteronomy chapter 28 is a blessing after blessing after blessing after blessing for your obedience to his Torah, and a curse if you disobey his Torah. Let's look at Psalms chapter 1. Psalms chapter 1 and verse 1. I really love these first few verses here. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the wicked. Why? Because evil communications corrupts good manners. Nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law, the Torah, that same Torah that he's going to put on our hearts under the new covenant. His delight is in that law of Yahweh. And in his law does he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bring forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he does shall prosper. And maybe that's why he says all throughout his Torah, his instructions, to think on it, to speak about it, when you lie down, when you rise up, when you walk by the way. He wants his instructions to be the focus of our lives. Okay, so let's look at Matthew chapter 5. And I'm going to start in verse 16. Let your light so shine before men. A couple verses previously, he says, you are the light of the world. Verse 16 says, let your light so shine before men so they can see your good works. So your good works are the light for people to see. And it says to glorify your Father in heaven. So these works have to come from your Father in order for them to glorify your Father. So how do we know what the good works of the Father are if the Son came and did away with them? So these good works have to be attributed to the Father, which is in heaven. And the very next verse says, don't even think. Don't even let it come into your mind that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, which is probably why he said, I call heaven and earth as a witness against you, because heaven and earth is still here. Till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. That's another red flag verse right there, folks. If a pastor or a teacher tells you any part of those instructions, we're supposed to take away from them, add to them, or modify them, they're a false teacher. Whosoever therefore shall break one of the least commandments, most likely referring to the commandments found in the Torah and the prophets that he just talked about, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. That's how you know who a true teacher is and who a false teacher is. Teaching you to obey, teaching you not to obey. You can only be one or the other. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven, showing that just observing the letter of the law is not enough. It has to be something internal. Let's look at Luke 16 and verse 17. It is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. Acts 21 verse 17. Acts chapter 21 verse 17. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly, and the day following Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things Elohim had wrought amongst the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified Yahweh, and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and They are all zealous of the law. This would be a good time for Paul to say, well, why are they zealous for the law? Yeshua nailed it to the cross. But instead, they're boasting that these people, these Jewish people, believe in Yeshua and they still want to be obedient to the law. But verse 21 says there's a bad rumor going on about you. They are informed of thee, Paul, that you're teaching all the Jews which are amongst the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. So this is a false report. And guess what? That false report is still going on today, saying that Paul taught everybody not to obey the law of Moses. Verse 22, what is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this, that we say to thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify themselves with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that that rumor, those things whereof they were informed concerning thee, are nothing. It's a lie. So do this to prove that thou thyself also walk orderly and keep the law. Let's look at Romans chapter 2, verse 12. And as we're reading through these verses, we need to determine, is this talking about something different? Did law here mean something else? Now, there are a few places when it's referring to the tradition of the rabbinical tradition. But it's very clear in these verses what Torah he's talking about. Chapter 2 and verse 12, for as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law. The Bible defines sin as transgression of the law. So if you are transgressing Yahweh's instructions, even though you didn't know them, you are going to perish in your rebellion. And as many as have sinned in the law, meaning they knew it, they shall be judged by it. For not the hearers of the law are just before Elohim, but the doers of the law shall be justified. James said the same thing, except he said the word. Not the hearers of the word are just before Elohim, but the doers of the word. Verse 14, for when the Gentiles which have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. Meaning, if you did not know the law, your conscience is going to be your judge. Your conscience is either going to excuse you or it's going to accuse you, because he gives us the ability to know right and wrong. Chapter 3 of Romans, verse 29. Is he the Elohim of the Jews only? Is he not also of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Seeing it is one Elohim which shall justify the circumcision by faith and uncircumcision through faith. Do we make void the law through faith? Because we have this faith in Yeshua, do we do away with his Torah that is supposed to be in our hearts? Certainly not. Yea, we establish the law. If you do a nice little word study on void and establish, you'll find out it's very clear. When we have this faith, are we nullifying, doing away with this Torah? No, we establish it. We cause it to stand. Chapter 7 of Romans, verse 12. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good, which is why he did away with it. No, I'm just kidding. He doesn't say that. Verse 14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. So his law is a spiritual thing. It's supposed to be written on our hearts in the Spirit. Let's look at chapter 8 and verse 3. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh. You remember the comparison between the two covenants? One flesh, one spirit. The law could not change the flesh. So Yahweh, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh, meaning he put an end to the power of sin in the flesh, which is why Paul said, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, because you're supposed to be dead to the power of sin through the power of the Spirit that gives you the ability to tell the flesh no. So it says he condemned sin in the flesh so that, verse 4, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh but after the Spirit. So if we're walking in the Spirit and he's condemned sin in our flesh, it gives us the ability to walk out the righteousness of the law, which is simply obeying through a heart of love. Let's look at Philippians chapter 3. And verse 4. Philippians 3 and verse 4. We need to remember these few chapters here. When someone tries to tell us that Paul taught that we no longer need to obey Yahweh's instructions, or that Paul taught that Yahweh's perfect instructions that endure forever were nailed to a cross and they don't endure forever, or when they tell us he abolished his commandments, these are all verses taken out of context, or that Paul redeemed us from the law that was a curse, which it actually says redeemed us from the curse of the law, which is death, or in Romans 10 that in the Messiah Messiah is the end of the law for righteousness. That's Romans chapter 10. What it means is he put an end to righteousness of the law. By the law, your righteousness can only be found in him. But they interpret that as he's the end of the law, period. So anyway, when you hear verses like that that are twisted out of context, remember these verses in Philippians chapter 3, verse 4. Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I am more circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the assembly, touching righteousness, which is in the law, blameless. According to Paul, he was blameless concerning righteousness of the law. Well, guess what? You can't teach against the law and be blameless. You can't teach everybody not to obey the law and claim to be blameless concerning the law. Why? Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 13. This is the other false teacher test. Look at verse 4. Chapter 13, verse 4. You shall walk after Yahweh your Elohim, and fear him, and keep his commandments, and obey his voice. And you shall serve him, and cleave unto him. And that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he hath spoken to turn you away from Yahweh your Elohim, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage, to thrust thee out of the way which Yahweh thy Elohim commanded thee to walk in. So shalt thou put evil away from the midst of thee. That's another good couple verses to memorize there. Because based off of these verses, if the Messiah changed his Father's instructions, he was worthy of death. If Paul or the disciples changed Yahweh's word or told people not to keep it, they were worthy of death according to the scriptures. We cannot interpret anything from Matthew to Revelations that is a contradiction to Yahweh's instructions, because whoever wrote it would be a false teacher worthy of death. Any place in the New Testament that is talking about Yahweh's instructions, it's not referring to the compilation of Matthew to Revelations. That is not New Covenant law. And if we want to be in the New Covenant, it does not mean submitting to Matthew to Revelations. It means being grafted into Israel and his Spirit coming into our life, changing our hearts, and giving us a heart to obey him because we love him. Hallelujah.